introduce. And I guess, I'm going to start out with some introductory remarks, and we have then two other speakers who I will introduce. So I wanted to begin with saying that since this is somewhat of a more academic setting, I thought I wanted to talk about one difference between Marxism and other forms of philosophy. Is so many forms of philosophy are always looking for the eternal truth. You find that, it's this search for the eternal reality or the eternal truth. But Marxism says very clearly that all that exists in the universe is matter in motion, right? There is no eternal truth, there is no reality. The only thing constant is change, right? The world is constantly evolving and changing. One example I like to give of that is, my grandparents, they went to college on the GI Bill. Didn't pay a cent to go to college. They went to college on the GI Bill. My parents they paid for college. My father was able to pay for college by working throughout the summer. He would pay for his tuition and room and board just by working for the summer. It was enough to pay for the whole year. But now we are in a situation. We have this new phenomenon of students being in debt for years for getting an education. This is a very new thing. It's not just the way it has to be. If you went to CUNY in the 40s and you asked them what their tuition was, they would tell you they weren't paying any tuition. Now you go to CUNY, people are paying thousands of dollars. This is a changing situation. It's constantly changing. As much as the bourgeoisie would like us to believe that education has always been expensive, you go to most European countries, it's free, right? So there's nothing permanent in the universe. Things are constantly changing. And one phenomenon we're seeing now increasingly is a rise in police brutality and police state repression. We talk about 2.2 million people in prison. We talk about the fact that they now, not only do they have the drones that are used internationally to bomb and destroy and kill people in other countries, they now have surveillance drones that they're using to spy on people for police operations here in the United States. When I was in Cleveland, when I was first, getting involved with political activism, I worked around the case of a young woman named Rebecca Whitby. Rebecca Whitby was about 21 years old, and she one night she'd had a little too much to drink. And so she came home, and she was going to get in her car and drive. And her father, who was a former alcoholic, he didn't want her to get in the car and drive. And so he made what he said was the worst decision he ever made in his life, and he called the police. So the police showed up, and by the time the police had arrived, he met him at the door and he said, my daughter, she's not going to get in the car. Everything's okay. You can go. He pushed him aside, and they went up into the house. They went up into the house, they saw Rebecca sitting there, and they grabbed her, and they ripped her shirt off, and they began to strangle her with it, and they threw her to the ground, and they stomped on her. And so then Rebecca's mother ran and threw her body over Rebecca Whitby, and so the police then jumped on Rebecca's mother and began stomping on her, and they were both dragged to a police car, and as they were dragging them, the neighbors who'd lived across the street from the years came out, and they heard the cops shouting, racial slurs at them as they threw them into a police car. And so they went to jail, they were taken to jail, and they were released without charges. And then they filed charges. They filed, not charges, but they filed a complaint against the officers that had done this to Rebecca Whitby and her mother. And when they filed a complaint, then they were charged with assault on a police officer, attempt to steal a police officer's firearm, all kinds of charges, right? It was very outrageous. They claimed that the reason they had beaten Rebecca Whitby senseless was that they had reached for, the gun. Well, there were no fingerprints on the gun. So the family, they were not going to plead guilty, and it took them 2 years. 2 years they kept going to court to fight this. They would have hearings for 2 years. And the father was a truck driver. He ended up losing his job. He ended up losing his job because he couldn't go on long truck runs because he had to go to court every 2 weeks with his family. And eventually it did get to a jury, and the jury acquitted them on all charges except for resisting arrest. But 2 years. And the mother also lost her job because she was up for a promotion at work. And for the promotion, it required a background check. And the background check came up that she had pending felony charges. So she lost her job too. So that was the case. For 2 years, they were going to court straight to fight the police, right? And, we, revolutionary activists, people in Workers' World Party, people in other organizations, before each of these court hearings they would have, for 2 years these proceedings drug on, we would have a rally in front of the courthouse. We would bring a banner, we'd bring signs, and we would be chanting, "The Whitbys are not guilty. You've got to set them free. The Whitbys are not guilty. You've got to set them free." And we were there for 2 years, and it was a long process before they even went to trial. Now, why did we go and do this? we have this idea that, it's this idea that being a communist, you hear that, it's kind of a Cold War idea that, so-and-so's a communist because they believe this. This guy's against the war, so he's a communist. Or, this guy, this person over here, she's got a fuzzy idea about economics. She must be a communist. But being a communist isn't really about what you believe. It's about what you do. You go to any socialist country, if you say you're a communist, that means someone who's a member of the Communist Party, someone who's leading the struggle to build socialism. That's what a communist is. A communist isn't about a belief, it's about what you do. And believe it or not, there was a time in this country, contrary to what we've all heard in our history classes, there was a time when there were millions of communists, right? You go back to the 1930s, you had these things called the unemployment councils, led by communists. And when a family would get evicted from their home, the communists would come and they would bust the locks and they would let the family back in and put the furniture back in. Back in the 30s, there was a militant labor movement. Now we have a labor movement that's very afraid to go on strike, very afraid to confront the bosses. But back then, in the 30s, when the communists were leading the labor movement, instead of just going on strike and walking out with a picket line, they would sit down in the factory and refuse to let business as usual continue. Or they would be out in front of the factory, fighting the bosses. You hear stories from Youngstown, Ohio, where they had a picket line. The workers were out there with their hunting rifles, not letting the scabs get through, and the bosses got an airplane to fly scabs over the picket line, and the workers worked very hard and figured out, and they shot down an airplane in Youngstown, Ohio. That's real U.S. history. The workers shooting down airplanes. That's part of the history of the working class. So much has been hidden from us in our working class history. But why was it that at that time there was such a strong fighting working class movement? It was because millions of people were inspired. There was the Great Depression in the United States. We hear about the Great Depression, and people lined up for blocks to get soup and things like that. But in the Soviet Union, there was a booming economy. There was no unemployment. There was actually a labor shortage. Thousands of engineers and technicians who couldn't find work in the United States were going to the Soviet Union to get work. In fact, the Soviet Union at that time was producing more tractors than any other country on earth. There was not a single unemployed person in the Soviet Union, and millions of people were looking to the Soviet Union as a symbol of what could be done contrary to capitalism. And one aspect of that was that the Soviet Union made a point of aligning with the black liberation struggle in the United States. There was a famous case, the Scottsboro 9. It was 9 African American men that were falsely accused of rape in the South. And not only was the communists in the United States leading demonstrations on behalf of the Scottsboro 9, but in the Soviet Union they had demonstrations. And Soviet workers who didn't even speak English, had never been to the United States, were having huge rallies in Red Square with signs that said, down with the Ku Klux Klan, down with Jim Crow, down with segregation, for racial equality. All of that was happening. And that was happening because, in the Soviet Union, it was a system we would refer to as socialism. It wasn't capitalism. In the Soviet Union, the banks, the factories, the industries, the commanding heights of the economy were held in common. They weren't owned by a small individual capitalist in order to make profits. They were rather held in common. And because they were held by all the people in common, they were used then for the benefit of everyone. They weren't used to make profits for an individual. It was a planned economy. And it was strong. And that really has been hidden from us. And we're here at the Left Forum. We're hearing from a lot of different political forces on the left, or some people even talk about the so-called left. But there's been such a tendency to shy away from Marxism, Leninism. There's this defensiveness. There's this this feeling that we have to back away from the legacy that we have. But if you look at it today, the record of Marxism, the problems that happened in the Soviet Union, they really happened because the Soviet Union was moving away from Marxism. Gorbachev, at the time the Soviet Union collapsed, Gorbachev was privatizing things. Gorbachev was getting up and he was renouncing Marxist ideas. He was saying he believed in universal human values. It was a deviation from Marxism that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And today, Cuba has the highest life expectancy in Latin America. They have a lower infant mortality rate than the United States. And despite being a small island, a poor country, they still export more medical aid than any other country on earth, right? More medical aid to countries all over the world, Africa, Asia, Latin America. Socialism, this idea that we need to find a new way, this idea that we got to back away from Marxism. We got to find, we got to find the flaw. We got to have a new synthesis or a new development. It's really problematic because right now more than anything, what we need, what the youth of today needs, we need a fighting Marxist-Leninist movement. We need what they had back in the 30s. We need a revolutionary movement. We need people like the unemployment councils busting the locks. We need something like the Trade Union Unity League. That was a militant, union organization devoted to the class struggle. We need these things because that's the only hope we have, right? Capitalism with the glut of unemployment, the only hope we have is a fighting youth movement based in the ideas of Marxism, right? Marxism-Leninism, right? The idea that you can have that there are two classes. There are those of us who sell our labor, right? Who sell our labor power, and there are those who own. And these two classes have nothing in common. We don't want to compromise between these two classes. One class fights against the other. As they used to say, class against class struggle. That's the ideology of Marxism and Leninism, the idea that we need a party of a new type, not a party like the Democrats or the Republicans where you just sign here and you're a member and you agree with some principles, but a combat party, a party coordinated and disciplined, devoted to every moment to seizing power, right? There have been losses, there have been changes, but the losses have come really because of so much of the deviation. They've come from the fact that people have gotten defensive, and also there have been economic factors. There were difficulties, but I guess I just want to say that I'll end on this. I want to say that what I want a revolutionary communist youth movement, a youth movement that's anti-sexist, anti-racist, anti-homophobic. I want a revolutionary communist youth movement that it's anti-imperialist and says no, at no time do the imperialists ever have the right to bomb and destroy a country, no matter what. I want a revolutionary communist youth movement that goes to young people, and says you have the right to a job, you have the right to education, and it's time to go out and fight for it. I want a revolutionary communist youth movement that's not afraid to wave the red flag and say we're communists and we have nothing to apologize for, it's time to have a revolution. I want a revolutionary communist youth movement that can go into the labor unions and fight against the labor bureaucracy and fight for a class struggle policy. I want a revolutionary communist youth movement that can be on the campuses and can challenge all the bourgeois crap we're hearing. I want a revolutionary communist youth movement, and this is the most important thing that's about winning. Because at the time that the communists were organizing in the 1930s, there was a book that they were all reading. It was like almost required reading in the revolutionary movement of that period. And it was called Towards Soviet America. It was by William Z. Foster. And in that book, William Z. Foster, who was the leader of the Communist Party at the time, was their presidential candidate. He gave a vision of what the United States would look like. And the last chapter of that book is called The United Soviet States of America. And he laid out a vision of what the U.S. could be like under workers' rule, what it could be like without the rule of profits. And he talked about how, after the revolution, they would take all the hotels, the luxury hotels that have empty rooms and are used for the rich people, and they would house all the unemployed workers who were living in the Hoovervilles. And he talked about how they would immediately abolish racism, and they would smash the Ku Klux Klan and outlaw it. And he talked about how they would immediately establish the right to jobs and abolish unemployment. He talked about all the things that could be done if the capitalist class were gotten rid of. And it was that vision that was with the workers who went and fought in the streets in the 1930s. They weren't just fighting for more cents an hour. They weren't just fighting to get the reforms that were won by the Roosevelt administration. They were fighting to build the United Soviet States of America. And I would like to live in the United Soviet States of America. I really would. I would like to live in a country where we don't have bosses, we don't have bankers, we don't have the horrors of racism and police brutality. I would like to live in a country that's not exploiting and leeching off the rest of the world and bribes a certain section of the working class into silence. I would like to live in a country where people are treated fairly and decently. And the only road to that is the ideology of Marxism, Leninism, and workers' power. And so that's what I'm here to talk about, and that's what we're here to engage about. It's how we can move toward building a socialist society where people aren't held down and beaten and degraded the way they have been for so long. So we're going to hear about that. We've got two speakers. Next, we're going to hear from my friend Scott Williams. He's an organizer in Philadelphia. He's been involved in labor. Now he's in Philadelphia. Was in North Carolina before that. He's been around, and we're going to hear from Scott.